Hey, this is Rue, and this is a review of Tower Dominion after 100%. This is a single player tower defense game with some roguelite elements. I'm going to start with an overview of the game and how it plays, talk about what I think works well, and then what I think could use improvement. Let's get into it. You start the game by choosing a leader from one of three factions, each of which gets some unique buildings and traits. The blue faction has a headquarters that you can upgrade into a really powerful fortress and makes little soldiers that leave your base at periodic intervals. The red faction gets double blueprints. Basically, when you get a building card, you can use it twice and lets you fight with tanks and a powerful commander. The green faction has no unit spawning and is totally reliant on buildings, but you get some economic benefits to compensate. Each faction plays in their own biome: blue in a desert, red in a snowy winter area, and green in a jungle with grassy clearings. Within each faction are 10 commanders, each with 2 unique traits. These traits aren't game-changing, but usually offer enough of a bonus to influence how you want to play. You start the game with only a few commanders unlocked, and as you progress, you'll unlock more. You set the game difficulty at the start of each run, choosing from 5 levels. Levels 1 through 4 affect how many entrances to your base that you'll have to defend, as well as how many waves you'll have to face. Level 5 is a special Frontier mode, which is basically level 4 with some added difficulty modifiers of your choice. Once you start the game, you'll be forced to place a first terrain tile. You build your own maps in this game, which is an added layer of strategy. The game draws a distinction between battlefronts and entry points. The game shows your current number of battlefronts and entry points via these numbers and diagrams at the top of the screen, which is useful. It's possible to combine paths to reduce the number of battlefronts, even down to 1, but there are pros and cons to doing this. There are 3 basic resources: supply, recon, and tech. Supply is the primary resource in the game and used for the majority of building placements and upgrades. Recon lets you reroll terrain tiles and is used for placing scout hideouts and a small number of other building upgrades. Tech can be used for some very powerful upgrades, but it's also the most rare resource. You start the game with 10, and unlike the other 2, it's very difficult to replenish. Each faction starts the game with the blueprints for a few basic buildings. There's a tile elevation system, and it's important. A building at higher elevation gets additional range, and this can tie into other bonuses. Buildings must be placed on level terrain, and there are platforms you can use to increase tile height when needed. Each building, including the headquarters, has 3 upgrade options. Some of the late game upgrades are extremely powerful but have a price to match. Once you're satisfied with your setup for a round, you hit send wave and watch an assortment of enemy bugs crawl and fly towards your base. The initial enemies are the same from game to game, but at waves 10, 20, and 30, you draw new threats, and these can vary significantly. Some enemies have shields, some can fly, reducing regular weapon damage, some are camouflaged, and so on. The game gives you a warning of upcoming enemies 3 waves ahead, so you have a bit of time to prepare. As you'd expect, certain buildings and upgrades are more suited to different enemy types. For example, this super heavy pulse weapon specializes in taking out large, shielded targets. These heavy artillery positions are great at dealing AoE damage to clustered enemies, and so on. Once a wave is completed, you get a choice between reinforcement bundles. Each bundle contains 2 cards of varying types: blueprints, giving you the ability to build a certain type of building; doctrines, giving you some kind of permanent upgrade; and resources, which are exactly what they sound like. As you play the game, you'll unlock additional cards. Some of these will be from winning the game with certain leaders, others will come from upgrading certain buildings, and so on. As you play, the game gets easier. Not only do you gain experience, you also gain powerful cards that you can draw in future runs. The game continues like this until either your base loses all health or you complete the final wave, which comes with some sort of unique extra challenge. If you survive the final wave, you have the option to continue in endless mode until you get tired of it or overwhelmed by enemies. Afterwards, you get a post-game screen showing which buildings did the most damage, which is a nice touch. One last thing in this section. When I say I'm reviewing this game after 100%, what do I mean by that? In this case, I've beaten the game with every leader for all 3 factions on a variety of difficulty levels, including Frontier mode. I've unlocked almost everything in the Codex, and I'm just missing a few of the expert building blueprints and doctrines. Let's move on to what I liked about Tower Dominion. There's a lot to like here, and overall I've had a lot of fun with this game. First, I really like the clean, minimalist art style and UI. The game lets you zoom in surprisingly far, and when you do, there's more detail than you'd expect. I get that this may be personal preference, but the art design of this game is a 10 out of 10 for me, with one exception that we'll get to later. The second thing I like is that despite looking deceptively simple, the game throws a lot of decisions at you, particularly on the higher difficulties. These start with the terrain tiles, which are very important to how each game will play out. Depending on your faction and intended strategy, you might want to reduce your battlefronts and simplify these into a single kill corridor and use AoE weapons like artillery to smash the enemy at range. Or maybe you're playing a base fortress strategy with the blue faction, and you just want the paths to be as long and convoluted as possible to buy time for your cannons to hit the enemy waves. The second but related level of decisions has to do with buildings, placement, and upgrades. There's a wide variety of buildings and strategies available. Do you want to rely on large numbers of cheap, basic buildings like bunkers and towers, or smaller numbers of expensive, upgraded buildings like rocket launchers and pulse cannons? The game forces your hand a bit here due to randomness, which we'll talk about in a minute, but usually it's possible to adapt with what the game gives you. For example, I had a max difficulty challenge run where I drew 5 out of 6 shielded enemies. However, despite not drawing anti-shield weapons, I was able to use an artillery-heavy strategy to still complete the challenge. Overall, the basic game loop is fun and very replayable. A lot of that replayability comes from randomness, which is everywhere in this game and I think both its greatest strength and biggest weakness. Let's look at all the layers of randomness. The initial terrain layout around your base, the terrain tiles you pull throughout the game, your reinforcement choices after each round, enemy composition, and even which entry points enemies will take. This sounds like a small thing, but getting unlucky with enemy entry location can end games and result in 2 adjacent waves having very different outcomes. On higher difficulty levels, you get even more randomness, in the form of additional helpful card draws at the start and intermittent negative draws throughout the game, some of which are much worse than others. The upside of this is that no game will play exactly the same, which is great. The downside is that game difficulty is all over the place. Back-to-back games with the same initial leader and difficulty settings can feel wildly different. Getting a good initial base layout, getting lucky with terrain tiles, getting some strong per-turn supply upgrade doctrines early, all this makes a game much easier. I'm not trying to say the randomness is bad. I like it, but just know what you're getting into. If you're the kind of player that has to build a particular building every game and can't be flexible or adaptive, this may not be the game for you. Let's move on to some areas in which I think the game can be improved. The first is going to be the name and the Steam splash art/logo. This feels like the most generic title and logo possible, and something you would find in the depths of your phone's app store. What's wild is that the in-game art style is so good, and the logo is this. The game's title screen is the perfect example. The background looks great, but I'm just not a fan of this logo. Maybe I'm in the minority here, and this is just a personal issue, and it's probably too late to change the name anyways. My next issue is that there can be an occasional stutter or hiccup mid-wave. There's also some kind of weird overflow bug that causes building damage to show up as all 4 sometimes. Both of these are pretty minor issues, but it'd be great if the devs could clean them up. Parts of the game could also use some balancing tweaks. The example that comes to mind are the final wave challenges. If you get lucky, you get disrupted logistics, causing upgrades to be a bit more expensive. If you get unlucky, you draw this massive enemy with 80,000 health that can one-shot your base. These are not even close to each other in terms of difficulty. Also, some of the leaders feel way stronger than others, but maybe that's intentional. With this being a single-player game, there's no requirement that they all have to have a similar power level. Another minor issue is that the Steam achievements are really uninspired. There's an achievement tied to beating the game with each leader, and that's it. There's so much opportunity for more creative achievements in a game like this. Off the top of my head, you could have achievements for winning different difficulty levels, winning with or without certain buildings, for doing 100,000 damage in one game with a specific building type, and so on. This could give people who have finished the game with all the leaders some extra goals to chase down. My last area of improvement is the most tied to the actual mechanics of the game, which overall I think are excellent, and this has to do with building targeting control and prioritization. Most tower defense games let you set this on a per building basis. For example, focus aerial units, focus highest health, focus closest to base, etc. Tower Dominion doesn't do that, and by default most weapons seem to default to target closest to base. The most control you get is with a few building upgrades. For example, this upgrade that changes the target priority to anti-air. Even this doesn't act like you'd expect though. Once a building starts firing at a target, it won't switch to another until either that target dies or goes out of range. So you'll see buildings with anti-air priority shooting at ground targets while aerial units fly past. The silliest thing here has to do with detection, the ability for a building to shoot at camouflaged units. You can get detection upgrades, but they don't seem to change target priority. I'd like to see some improvements to targeting logic and maybe increased control in this area. Let's sum this up. Even with a few minor gripes, I've had a lot of fun with this game, and I think for $17 US, it's a really good value if you like tower defense games. I think there are plenty of ways for the devs to polish and expand this, and I really hope they do so. Additional leaders, factions, buildings, enemy types, and so on. I'd also be interested in more opportunities for long-term progression, maybe in the form of a multi-part campaign, but even if they don't, I still think this is a game that I'll come back to every once in a while. I think that about wraps this one up. I want to give a shout out to the patrons and YouTube members who help support this channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.